raw hide steams beside a frozen fjord. Salt crackles against stiff hair, and the air smells of flesh and sea. Without this invisible labor, the Vikings would not have survived the cold, nor sailed as far as they did. Archaeological finds in Hedeby confirm the presence of tanning workshops set directly beside the water. But how did they transform rot into leather strong enough to last for years? Chapter 1. The hide before the leather. Before becoming leather, a hide is an enemy. It breathes, it swells, it rots. In the Viking world, a freshly removed animal skin was a race against time. If no one intervened, within days it became useless, soft, foul-smelling, incapable of shielding against wind or steel. In the northern regions, where cold showed no mercy and survival depended on every detail, a hide was more than a commodity. It was a necessity. For the Vikings, leather did not only clothe the body, it gave life to ships, weapons, boots, and even the shields that protected them in battle. But how could raw skin be transformed into something useful before it fully decayed? The answer lay in a long, laborious, and often dangerous process, one that required more than manual skill. It demanded an intimate understanding of nature itself and the ability to control the invisible forces acting within the material. Between the 9th and 10th centuries, settlements such as Hedeby in what is now Germany and Birka in Sweden stood as major commercial hubs of the Viking world. These places were not only markets for exotic goods and weapons, but also centers where leather was worked intensively. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of damp pits, iron blades, bone scrapers, and vast quantities of cattle bones, clear evidence of the importance of tanning as an industry. The Vikings understood that without leather, their way of life simply could not exist. Every corner of the settlement was permeated by this need to cure and transform animal skin. The challenge of decomposition. The problem was simple and brutal. Raw hide begins to decompose the moment the animal dies. It swelled, became slick, and slowly bacteria began their work. For the tanner, this meant one thing. He had to act almost immediately. If he did not, the hide became worthless, and countless hours of labor were lost. Time was the enemy, and tanning was a constant struggle against decay. If handled improperly, the hide lost its strength and elasticity, soon becoming riddled with mold stains and a stench impossible to remove. Salt, the first line of defense. The first defense against decomposition was salt, not as seasoning, but as a fundamental preservative. Coarse salt was spread by hand across hair and fresh flesh, pressed firmly into every fold. In doing so, it absorbed moisture, creating a protective barrier that slowed decay. Hides were stored this way, layered thick with salt, for months if necessary. In colder regions, skins could be preserved even longer, so long as the delicate balance of moisture and temperature was maintained. But salt could only go so far. Though preserved, the hide was still not ready. Salt stopped rot. It did not create usefulness. That required another kind of intervention: texture, smell, and relentless labor. Working raw hides involved far more than applying salt. In the dim light of workshops or camps set along the edges of fjords, the work was done with strong, calloused hands. Viking tanners did not merely treat skin. They engaged directly with the nature of flesh and hair. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of dried blood, animal fat, and the sharp, damp bite of salt that clung to everything. Hands cracked, fingers burned after hours of labor under sun or rain. Once dried and hardened by salt, the hides developed a thick, fibrous texture that demanded careful handling. If the work lacked precision, the skin became brittle and useless. The ground, slick with scraps of bone and flesh, was treacherous underfoot. The fjord wind cut through clothing, chilling to the bone, and the water used to wash the hides was icy even in summer. The tanning process did not stop for weather. The climate was part of the process. Controlling time. Tanning was not only about preservation, it was a battle with timing. Tanners needed to know exactly when to remove the salt, when to soak the hide in fresh water, and when to strip away hair without damaging the structure beneath. Too long in salt made the hide rigid. Too little salt allowed decay to return. Moisture levels, temperature, exposure to air. Every factor had to be controlled with care. When the salted hide finally returned to water, a critical phase began. Hair loosened, residual flesh partially dissolved. Yet the material remained inert, unfinished, waiting for the next steps that would determine the final quality of the leather. The hidden key. The first step toward quality salt was essential, but it was never the final answer. The next turning point in the transformation of raw hide was even more decisive. As time pressed on, Viking tanners faced the next challenge, removing the hair completely. A single mistake here could ruin weeks of work. How could the hair be stripped away without destroying the skin itself? What methods allowed the hide to survive while its surface was torn free? This was only the beginning of a long and winding process. But here lay the foundation, mastering the conversion of raw hide into a material capable of resisting wind, water, and combat. A well-treated hide could last for years, and the Vikings knew that this first step would shape everything that followed. How did the Vikings remove the hair without destroying the hide? Chapter 2. Removing the hair, not the hide. The process did not restart, it became more dangerous. Once the hide left the salt behind, it entered a phase where everything could be lost. Fresh water awakened it. Slowly, it swelled, regained flexibility, and with it, the risk returned. If something failed now, the hide did not spoil. It was destroyed. Viking tanners knew this critical point well. It is not described in the sagas, but archaeology confirms it. In Birka, Hedeby, and Jorvik, damp pits associated with tanning zones have been found, deliberately separated from living areas. Not by chance. The stench and toxicity of this phase made it impossible to live alongside it. The objective was clear: remove the hair without damaging the dermis. The problem was brutal. Hair is firmly anchored to the skin. Tearing it out by force ripped the hide apart. Cutting it was useless. It had to release on its own. The solution was neither immediate nor clean. Hides were submerged for days in pits of stagnant water mixed with wood ash, rich in lime, or with slaked quicklime. This was not an improvised invention. In Scandinavia, soil analyses from ancient workshops show elevated calcium concentrations consistent with these baths. The lime raised the pH, weakening the hair root and slowly separating the epidermis from the dermis. The process was not silent. The water bubbled faintly. The hide swelled until it seemed almost unrecognizable. The smell changed. It was no longer fresh flesh or salt, but something deeper, sharper, almost sweet, an odor that clung to clothing and hair. The tanner knew that this smell meant progress and danger. Each day, the hides had to be moved. If left still, they stuck together, fermented unevenly, and were ruined. In excavations at Hedeby, long wooden poles hardened by use have been found, interpreted as tools for stirring hides in deep pits. This was not light labor. The water was icy even in spring. Arms went numb. Lime burned into small cracks in the skin of the hands. After several days, the exact time depending on climate, animal species, and the tanner's experience, the hair began to loosen. It did not fall away on its own. It had to be removed. The hides were spread over wooden benches or smooth logs. With curved iron blades or bone scrapers, the tanner pushed the hair outward. He did not cut, he pushed. Too much pressure toward the dermis, too little, and the hair held fast. It was a balance learned over years, passed down not through writing, but through observation and error. The sound was dry, repetitive. Scrape, advance, stop. The feel beneath the hands changed, from rough to smooth, from rigid to elastic. When the hair was gone, the hide revealed a pale, almost whitish color, swollen in texture. It was not leather, not yet. It was vulnerable, open, exposed. Here lay the greatest risk. A hide left too long and lime weakened. Too little time left organic residues that would later rot from within. For this reason, once dehaired, the hides had to be washed repeatedly in clean water, often in nearby rivers. It is no coincidence that Viking tanneries were always located beside flowing water. In York, sediment analyses reveal traces of animal fat and collagen fibers downstream from ancient craft districts, a direct sign of these intensive washings. The river was not scenery, it was a tool. When the hide emerged from this phase, it was free of hair, but not free of danger. It had survived salt, water, and lime. Now it was ready to absorb something new, something irreversible. because from this point forward the hide could no longer return to what it had been. What substance made the hide stop rotting forever? Chapter 3. The Birth of Leather. The hide no longer had hair. It also had no return. After water, lime, and scraping, it entered a silent phase, less visible but decisive. Here, the hide stopped being animal waste and became something new. This is where leather was born. The Vikings did not speak of chemistry, but they mastered it. They knew that a clean, swollen, pale hide would rot again unless something more was done. To prevent this, they needed a substance capable of penetrating deep inside and fixing the internal structure of the dermis. The answer came from the forest. In Scandinavia, vegetable tanning relied on tannins extracted from bark, roots, and wood. Oak, alder, birch, and willow were the most commonly used. At sites such as Birka and Hedeby, large accumulations of crushed bark and the remains of wooden containers have been found in damp areas, interpreted as tanning vats. These were not domestic leftovers. They were industrial remains. Preparation began far from the hide itself. Bark was stripped in spring when sap made it easier to separate from the trunk. It was air-dried, then crushed into small fragments. This material was mixed with water, creating a dark, bitter liquid that stained everything it touched. The smell was earthy and vegetal, less aggressive than earlier stages, but persistent. The hides were submerged in these baths for weeks. This was not a single container nor a single step. The process was gradual. Hides began in mild solutions and were slowly moved into more concentrated baths. Analyses of organic residues found in Hedeby show different tannin levels in layered sediments, evidence of prolonged, controlled stages. Time dominated everything. Day after day, the hides absorbed the liquid. They darkened slowly. To the touch, they stopped feeling gelatinous and became firm. The tanner removed them, folded them, pressed them with his hands, listening for a faint creaking sound, a sign that the internal structure was changing. The water no longer smelled of decay. It smelled of soaked wood. The workshop filled with that constant aroma. The cold remained. In winter, the process slowed. In summer, it accelerated and demanded constant attention. A mistake here did not reveal itself immediately. It appeared months later when the leather cracked or became brittle. Archaeology confirms this forced patience. In Jorvik, the remains of wooden vats show internal wear marks consistent with long immersion and repeated handling. Tanning was not a single act. It was daily coexistence with the hide. When the tanner judged that enough tannin had been absorbed, the hide was removed from the bath. Its color was no longer white. It ranged from light to dark brown, depending on the wood used. As it dried, the leather contracted slightly. That was why it had to be stretched, folded, and worked by hand while it still retained moisture. The sound had changed. It was no longer soft or viscous, but firm and resistant. At that moment, the hide crossed the threshold. It would no longer rot. It had become imputrescible. That was leather. But not all leather served the same purpose. Some pieces were stiff, intended for soles or shields. Others, more flexible, were reserved for clothing, straps, or sails. This difference depended not only on the animal, but on what came next. The tanning was complete. The work was not, because now the leather had to be shaped for its final fate. How did the Vikings make leather flexible without it breaking in the cold? Chapter 4. Taming the leather. The leather no longer rotted, but it was still not ready. Fresh out of vegetable tanning, it was stiff, coarse, sometimes as hard as a damp plank. In the north, that was not enough. Inflexible leather cracked in the cold, split under rain, and failed when it was needed most. The next challenge was no longer preservation, but domination. The Vikings understood that leather had to imitate living flesh. It needed to yield without breaking. To achieve this, they relied on a phase as physical as it was silent, confirmed by archaeology and comparative ethnography, the greasing and the working of the leather. At sites such as Birka and Kaupang, solidified animal fats have been found in craft contexts alongside polished wooden tools interpreted as leather-working implements. Fat was the soul of this transformation. Beef tallow, sheep fat, and even fish oils in coastal regions were used. It was not applied at random. The leather had to be slightly damp. Too dry, and it rejected the fat. Too wet, and it lost it. The tanner spread the hide and rubbed the fat in by hand, insisting on the thickest areas. The smell changed once again. No longer forest or lime, but animal. Dense, persistent. Then came the working. The leather was folded, twisted, and struck against posts or wooden benches. This was not violence, it was adaptation. Each movement broke internal microfibers, allowing the fat to penetrate and remain trapped. In cold climates, this step was decisive. Poorly worked leather turned to stone by morning. Hands suffered. Fat cooled. Leather resisted. Knuckles split. Arms burned with exhaustion. But the feel kept changing. From rigid to flexible. From rough to almost smooth. The tanner knew when to stop. There was no exact measure. Only experience. Climate set the pace. In winter, the process could take weeks. In summer, days. In Hedeby, the remains of semi-open structures near tanning areas suggest ventilated spaces, protected from direct sun and rain. Leather could not dry too fast. If it did, it cracked. If it stayed damp, it warped. Some leathers were lightly smoked, not to preserve them, but to seal the surface and repel water. Smoke infused the material, leaving it darker and giving it a scent that lingered for years. In shields and straps, this detail could mean the difference between withstanding a storm or becoming completely soaked. Here, the leather's fate was decided. Thicker pieces were reserved for soles, shields, and belts. More flexible ones for clothing, bags, or sails. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps were used for cords or reinforcements. In the Viking world, leather was too valuable to fail, but something was still missing. Leather was now strong and flexible, yet it also had to recognize its purpose. A sail was not a boot, a shield was not a harness. The final step was not found in fat or force, but in form. How did the Vikings adapt each piece of leather to its exact use before placing it? In the hands of a warrior or a sailor? Chapter 5. When Leather Faces the World. The leather was finished, but it had proven nothing yet. Up to this point, it had survived water, lime, bark, and fat. Now it had to confront real life. In the Viking world, a material was not valued for its process, but for its resistance when everything else failed. Before reaching the hands of a warrior or a sailor, leather passed through one final silent phase. Final adaptation. It was cut, thinned, stretched according to its destination. There was no universal measure. Each piece was shaped for a specific function. Leather sails required flexibility without distortion. Boots had to bend without opening cracks. Shields demanded firmness and the ability to absorb impact. At sites such as Gokstad and Oseberg, 9th century ship burials have preserved remnants of straps, reinforcements, and leather elements associated with the naval structure itself. These were not ornaments. They served to tension, secure, and absorb vibration. Leather was an active component of the ship, not an accessory. Climate was the final judge. Leather had to endure salt spray, rain, ice, and low sunlight. In experimental trials based on historical methods, well-greased vegetable tanned leather retains flexibility even below freezing. This resilience explains how Vikings could sail for weeks without their rigging failing. In combat, leather marked the boundary between survival and death. Shields covered in leather absorbed blows, prevented wood from splintering, and reduced the damage of blades. Shield remains from Trelleborg show organic layers adhered to their surfaces, consistent with leather coverings. This was not decoration, it was survival. Leather clothing blocked wind better than wool alone. Belts supported weapons, straps held vital components together. Even helmets, in some cases, incorporated leather elements for fit and shock absorption. Nothing was left to chance. Here, the circle closed. The hide that had once been waste became vital infrastructure. Any mistake made weeks earlier, too much lime, too little tannin, poorly applied fat, revealed itself now. The leather cracked, stiffened, or failed. There were no excuses. The world forgave no artisan errors. The tanner rarely received glory. His work remained hidden beneath layers of use, mud, and salt. Yet every successful voyage, every winter endured, every return alive bore his invisible mark. Without reliable leather, expansion, trade, and war were impossible. Archaeology confirms this in silence. Scattered remains, wear marks, fibers hardened by centuries. Not great monuments, but humble evidence of an essential craft. Leather does not tell epic stories, but it sustains them. When a warrior tightened his belt or a sailor pulled a strap before setting sail, He entrusted his life to a process that had begun long before in the stench of a raw hide. And so, without songs or sagas, leather held up the Viking world. If this craft was so vital, why does it barely appear in the Norse sagas? The craft that does not sing. Behind every Viking voyage, every raised shield, and every winter survived, there was a form of labor that almost no one celebrated. Archaeology in Hedeby, Birka, York, and Oseberg does not speak of heroes, but of humble remains, pits, bark, hardened fats, tanned fibers, silent proof that leather was vital infrastructure, not a minor detail. Without it, sails failed, boots split open, shields shattered. The Viking world was not sustained by iron and courage alone, but by knowledge passed down through anonymous hands, generation after generation. Crafts that never entered the sagas, yet made possible the stories we still remember. While the names of warriors were sung, others fought cold, moisture, and time so that those warriors could return alive. If you want to discover more about how the Vikings survived thanks to invisible knowledge, this journey is only beginning. What other forgotten crafts truly sustained Viking expansion?